Hi, welcome back to the second half of Session 4 of History 3375, CIA in the Third World. We've been following a couple of trends in the agency's history since the 1950s, since Allen Dulles was Director of Central Intelligence beginning in 1952. We've been looking at the one hand at the focus on Third World covert operations that evolved during the 50s and became intense through the 50s and 1960s and even into the 70s. And then we've secondly been looking at a series of problems that arose, beginning with the failure of the Bay of Pigs operation in 1961 and then subsequent scandals. And we've seen the reactions to that over time with the establishment of various investigative commissions and committees, and usually the replacement of the Director of Central Intelligence as an attempt to reform the agency. And we had brought that down to the time of William Colby and the famous investigations by the Church Committee in the 1970s. And we finished by looking at another problem for the agency that was strictly an internal matter, and that was James Angleton, who was in charge of internal security for the agency. And because of his experience with Kim Philby, he became obsessed with the idea that there were spies within the agency, moles, agents who were working for the KGB. And because of the disruptive nature of his ongoing and ceaseless investigations, he had to be forced into retirement because it was causing such internal damage to the agency. And as we will see here in the second half, it will have repercussions because the nature of those investigations and the disruption leads the agency to move in a different direction and to become far more cautious in investigating suspicious activities by their own officers. And that will be something that they will pay a price for as they do discover after decades that these moles may not have been there during Angleton's time, but they failed to look for them later on because of Angleton's activities, and as a result, there are several spy scandals that hit the agency, particularly in the 1990s. But before we get there, we have to look at yet another turnover in the position of Director of Central Intelligence. And here, if we go to the first slide for the second half, we see Stansfield Turner. Stansfield Turner was the Director of Central Intelligence appointed by President Jimmy Carter to replace William Colby. Colby had gone through all of the investigations with the Church Committee, and of course his reputation had been tarnished along with the agency as a result. So once again, the answer, as with John McCone after the Bay of Pigs, is bring in an outsider. We need somebody who can be objective, who is not part of this system of DCIs who come from Yale University and were OSS officers and have come up through the ranks of the CIA. And in Turner, they certainly got that. As a Navy admiral, he had been involved in intelligence work for the Navy, but he was certainly not part of the pattern of recruitment of DCIs that seemed to dominate in the agency in the 1950s and 60s. In fact, Turner himself became convinced that the problem just wasn't people like Dulles and Colby and others who were directors of Central Intelligence, but that there was a core of old boys in the agency, many of them with this same resume of Yale graduates, OSS officers, who had essentially created a culture within the CIA that had not been changed despite the appointment of past directors from the outside, and that what was needed to really reform the agency was to change that part of the agency's history, that there had to be a purge of these people, get rid of the old boy network that dominated the agency in order to introduce fresh blood, new thinking, new ways of doing things. And in fact, during his term, Turner forced the retirement of more than 200 CIA officers, senior people in the agency, who he felt had to be purged in order to give it a fresh start. So there is a dramatic transformation in the composition of the agency itself in terms of a number of people who shared this background, this OSS background, had been longtime associates of Dulles and Bissell and Colby and others. Most of these people, or many of them at least, are removed during Stansfield Turner's tenure as Director of Central Intelligence. Now, another issue that Turner has to deal with, if we go back to the slide again, is the issue of the Vietnam syndrome. Vietnam and the failure in Vietnam has a dramatic effect not only on the U.S. military, which of course sees it as its first and only failure, but on the agency itself, because the agency, as I said, had been involved in Vietnam really from the earliest days, from the mid-1950s. The agency had been involved in shaping the government of South Vietnam, and we'll see this in detail when we talk about Vietnam as a case, shaping that government and trying to defend it through the years, carrying out counter-espionage operations for it involved and paramilitary operations trying to defeat the communist insurgency. It had made an enormous commitment to Vietnam, and when it fails, there are many who blame the agency as much as they blame the military. But more than that, the Vietnam syndrome was a sense on the part of people in the United States that the old Cold War consensus was dead. The idea that any time the president rang the fire bell of communism, that the American people and Congress had to respond with wholehearted support, was over. That period was over. Now Congress was going to question the foreign policy of the president. Many people in Congress looked at what had happened in Vietnam and realized that it was a series of decisions made not just by one president, but by a succession of presidents, from Eisenhower to Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon. All of these people had been involved in this process, and that serious mistakes had been made. So that the president should no longer, the executive should no longer have this rubber stamp when it came to foreign policy. Now serious questions are going to be raised. And there is a general sense in Congress at this time that the United States must not put itself at risk getting engaged in counterinsurgency battles in third world countries. The military, for example, as was illustrated in the 1990 Gulf War, developed a strategy that if we're going to go in somewhere, we're going to go in with overwhelming force, quickly, get it over with, and get out. A strategy we recently abandoned. But in any case, that was the lesson that the military drew from Vietnam, that we can't be getting ourselves drawn in. And this came to rebound on the CIA as well, because one of the arguments is, well, the reason we get involved in these kinds of things is because the CIA, they're tinkering with third world countries. They're getting us involved in counterinsurgency operations that eventually require an all-out military response, and that's what led to Vietnam. So there is both this end of consensus, this refusal to simply rubber stamp decisions by the president, by both Congress and the American people, a far greater questioning of foreign policy, which now becomes a source of debate in the United States, ongoing debate, and a sense that the U.S. must be far more cautious in the future in the terms of the way it approaches its foreign policy problems, not to get involved and drag down into third world conflicts that are going to exhaust the military and exhaust American resources. On top of that new caution and that questioning, where the agency no longer has the kind of blank check, the automatic approval that it once enjoyed, there also comes another great failure, and that comes as a result of the Iranian Revolution. I mentioned in the first half today that in 1953 the CIA intervenes in Iran to help overthrow its government. A little over 25 years later, the United States suffers the reaction to that as the Islamic Revolution sweeps Iran, as the Shah, whom we had helped reinstall in power in 1953, is toppled, and an Islamic Republic is created, which is vehemently anti-American and remembers the events of 1953. And in 1979, Islamic militants seize the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, Iran, and take more than 50 Americans hostage, and continue to hold those Americans hostage for over a year. During the course of that hostage event, President Carter orders an attempt to rescue the hostages. And in the process, the CIA will assist the military in trying to carry out this rescue mission. However, the mission proves to be a disaster. The helicopters get caught in a sandstorm, there's a crash, and they have to withdraw before they can even make the attempt. And there are American casualties out of all of this. It's another black mark, part for the CIA, partly for the military. But out of this comes another aspect of covert operations that becomes significant. And if you look at the bottom part of this slide, you'll see the term black operations. One of the conclusions from the failed hostage rescue was that the reason for failure was that in trying to carry out this kind of activity, the U.S. had a series of separate bureaucracies, even within the military. The Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Air Force, and, of course, within intelligence operations as well. You've got the CIA, you've got the National Security Agency, etc. What was needed was a group composed of various elements, but primarily of the military, that would operate to carry out covert operations and would operate across these bureaucratic divisions. In other words, we can get some Navy SEALs, we can throw in some special forces from the Army, etc., and we will create units whose sole purpose would be to carry out rescue missions, carry out some type of covert attacks. This set of groups became known as black operations. The CIA will turn to them, as we will see in the future, to carry out paramilitary activities. One of the things that's happened to the CIA in the aftermath of Vietnam is that there has been a downgrading of its paramilitary capacity. In other words, the kind of people that planned and carried out the Bay of Pigs and Iran and Guatemala, those people are being sloughed off from the agency after Vietnam. And we're going to have a lot less to do with covert operations and paramilitary operations in third world countries. We don't get tied down like that anymore, so we don't need all these people. And in the future, the agency, as we will see, will ally itself with the black operations to carry out some of these activities. Now, Stansfield-Turner's period of directorship marks another low point for the agency in the sense of all of these accumulated problems. The impact of the Vietnam syndrome, closer supervision of the agency, the disaster in the rescue effort in Iran. But with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, there is a resurgence of the agency and its activities. And if we go to the next slide here, we'll see that the man who will now head the CIA, although he did not have a career in the agency, is in many ways a part of the old boy network. In fact, his roots, the roots of William Casey, go all the way back to Wild Bill Donovan, the director of the OSS, the creator of the OSS. William Casey had been in the OSS. He was a successful New York lawyer, served his time in the OSS, and like Donovan before him, was fascinated with intelligence operations, was a great admirer of Donovan, wanted to see him direct the CIA, and had longed for years to have a role in the agency and its activities. Now, with Reagan's election, he gets that opportunity. And in 1981, he becomes the director of Central Intelligence. And as I put it here on the slide, it's like Wild Bill rides again. In other words, it's like Donovan is back in place because Casey was as much an advocate of covert operations as Bill Donovan, as Allen Dulles. This is a man that believed that those kinds of activities had been shunted aside, shouldn't have been, that they were an effective way for the agency to impact world events, and what was needed was a more aggressive policy. And this fit right in with Ronald Reagan's view that we had to get past the Vietnam syndrome. We needed to go out and have an aggressive foreign policy. Reagan believed that we needed to go out and roll back communist revolutions. The way Ronald Reagan looked at it, if you look at events from the time of the Chinese communists in China taking power in 1950, all the way down to 1975, where the communists take power in Vietnam, there had been a string of events, the Cuban Revolution would be another example, where communists had taken power and all of these revolutions had succeeded and still held power. The U.S. had to attack and roll back some of these revolutions. And he wanted the CIA to take an active hand in that aggressive foreign policy. As a result, the CIA would see a dramatic increase in funding and in the number of its personnel. After Vietnam, there had been a drastic reduction in both money and personnel. Personnel had almost been halved, almost down to 8,000 in the CIA. It was almost double that during the height of the Vietnam War. Now those numbers would go back up to the levels they had reached in the late 60s. So there'd be a rapid infusion of money and people back into the agency to give it new life. And Casey, of course, had the kind of ambition and vision to put these new resources to use. If we go back to the slide, we'll see that one of the places that the agency would choose to take a stand would be in Afghanistan. We talked a little bit about Afghanistan, talking about U.S. foreign policy before, that the Soviets invade in 1979, fearful that Islamic groups will take control of Afghanistan and destabilize the Islamic republics that are part of the Soviet Union. So they see it as a preemptive measure to prevent the destabilization of parts of their own empire. The United States sees it as an aggressive action, believing that the Soviets are intent upon projecting their power using Afghanistan as a base and projecting that power into the Middle East and gaining control over Middle East oil resources. So the U.S. wants to respond. They want to whittle down the Soviets, and there is a certain desire for payback, because the Americans believe that the Soviets did not do everything they could to try to curtail North Vietnam's activities. They did not do everything they could to try to help bring the Vietnam War to an end, and in fact had seen it as an opportunity to bleed the Americans and to bleed their military capacity. Well, now the U.S. policymakers see Afghanistan as an opportunity to bleed the Soviets. The U.S. becomes involved in supporting the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen are Islamic fighters, guerrillas, who are organizing the resistance against the Soviet Union. Now, these forces are not considered sufficient in and of themselves to undermine the Soviets. And therefore, there is a multilateral effort to recruit thousands of young men across the Middle East to join in the war in Afghanistan. These people become known as the Afghan Arabs. Afghanis are not Arabs. They don't speak Arabic. These people were from the Middle East. They were from Arabic-speaking countries, but they were to be recruited to fight in Afghanistan. That's where the name comes from. Among those who would be a part of the recruiting and training effort is, of course, Osama bin Laden. And again, we're going to get into more detail on this when we look at the Age of Terror later on. Osama bin Laden was not working hand in glove with the CIA. He was working with the sponsorship of the Saudi government. But they were working on related efforts, both sides seeking to train Afghan Arabs and the Mujahideen. The CIA would do it indirectly through Pakistani intelligence services. We'll talk a little bit more about that again when we get to the Age of Terror. But it does involve the U.S. with the training and equipping of thousands of Islamic militants to go fight in Afghanistan. And this is going to be something that will come back and haunt the CIA in the future. This effort to assist these groups and to turn them loose on the Soviets. Now, when we come to the next slide, this effort, despite hundreds of millions of dollars that are being poured in, was still not succeeding in undermining the Soviet occupation. as of 1985. In other words, this has been a struggle that's gone on for 5 years, and the Soviets are certainly paying a price. But still, they had an enormous set of advantages. I mean, they had armored personnel carriers, tanks, and most of all, helicopters. Combat helicopters that were a major advantage in attacking the Mujahideen and the Afghan Arabs. The kinds of gunships that the U.S. had employed effectively in Vietnam were the same kinds of vehicles that were being used by the Soviets to combat the Islamic insurgency in Afghanistan. The solution was shoulder-launched missiles. Now, the Mujahideen had acquired some weapons, shoulder-launched missiles that were of Soviet manufacture, Eastern European manufacture, but they were not as effective as the American version, in part because with the other versions you actually had to stand up as the helicopter approached you and fire at it head-on, which often meant that the pilot saw you first and would blow you to pieces before you could launch it. With the American Stinger, their version was far more effective, did not expose the person carrying it to as much danger, and was far better in terms of its heat-seeking capacity in finding its target. The U.S. had hesitated for years, partly because of a concern that the Soviets would see this as an escalation and might take some type of counteraction, causing the U.S. problems elsewhere in the world, but also the very real danger of turning over thousands of these very efficient weapons to people whom we had limited ties to. I mean, after all, our connections to the Mujahideen and the Afghan Arabs were strictly a matter of convenience, that they were there, they wanted to fight and kill the Soviets, we were happy to help them do it, but did we really want to put thousands of Stinger missiles in their hands? Nevertheless, in 1986, after considerable pressure, partly coming from Congress, the CIA was given permission to supply the Stingers, and they had a devastating effect on the Soviet war effort. They were able to bring down hundreds of Soviet helicopters. Soviet casualties rose dramatically. It greatly limited the Soviets' ability to use the helicopters and therefore to defend their ground troops. And finally, in 1989, at the very end of 1989, December of that year, the last Soviet troops evacuated Afghanistan. Now, in addition to that effort, which in some ways was sort of the ideal strategy that the CIA wanted to use now, of using surrogates. You know, we'll let somebody else do it. We don't want to get directly involved. We'll train another army somewhere to do these things. Now, as we look at the slide again, you'll see that Nicaragua became another such opportunity during this same period. In 1979, the dictatorship of Anastasio Somoza in Nicaragua, which is a U.S.-backed government, the U.S. had been backing this regime ever since the 1930s, was overthrown by insurgents known as the Sandinistas, and again we'll come back and talk about all of this in detail when we talk about Nicaragua, but the government was overthrown by insurgents who were certainly aligned with and favorable to Fidel Castro in Cuba. They were leftists. They were seen as communists. And for Ronald Reagan, this became a prime example of another communist revolution, but this one was going to be rolled back. He was going to demonstrate that communist revolutions could no longer succeed, could no longer hold power. He was going to stop this revolution and overthrow the Sandinistas. To do that, the CIA organizes a force known as the Contras. It's short in Spanish for counter-revolutionaries. It consisted of soldiers from the old regime who are trained by the CIA and sent into Nicaragua, more than 10,000 of them eventually, to launch an insurgency, a rebellion against the government, and hopefully cause its overthrow. The problem for the CIA in launching this operation was that they didn't have the people to train the Contras and to carry out the various logistical operations needed for this kind of major paramilitary undertaking. You're talking 10,000, it would eventually reach 15,000 troops that were part of the Contra army. The question was, where are the knuckle draggers? It was an expression referring to the guys that were in military operations or paramilitary operations, meaning they were knuckle draggers. They were like gorillas. They dragged their knuckles on the ground. That's where the expression came from. And the CIA is notably short of these people after Vietnam. It's at this point that the CIA links up again with black operations in the military. Black operations units have been working on precisely these kinds of paramilitary skills, or insurgency operations, guerrilla operations, covert movement of military supplies, planning hit-and-run operations, etc. So the CIA is going to have overall responsibility for the intervention in Nicaragua. But much of the paramilitary activity, the training, etc., is going to be carried out by black operations units within the military. Ronald Reagan believes, if we go back to the slide, that he was going to prove that the Vietnam syndrome had ended, that we could be aggressive in foreign policy again and conduct it much as we had in the 1950s and 60s. We could send out the CIA to undertake a major covert operation of this sort and be successful at it. The problem is that you couldn't just undo history. And in fact, as we will see in detail when we get to this particular case, Congress soon begins questioning what Reagan is doing. And the fact is, this is not the 1950s or 60s. This kind of operation requires funding approval from Congress. And they're not going to do it covertly. They want an open debate. And while they approve money initially, over time, there are various measures that curtail the money that's being given to the CIA to fund the Contra war. Many people question the viability of this operation. Many question, whether it's even useful to be going after a small Central American country, etc. But the bottom line is that it becomes increasingly difficult by the mid-1980s for the Reagan administration to secure funding to support the Contras. In fact, they'll do private fundraising. They'll get people like this wealthy widow in Texas to donate $1 million to help keep the Contra war going. But it's clear that private fundraising isn't going to be nearly enough to support a war that's costing tens of millions of dollars every year. And if we go back to the slide, this leads to a new scandal. Now, to maintain this operation, the Contra war in Nicaragua, which was being operated by the CIA, but also had, of course, its paramilitary portion being conducted by the black operations units. There was needed a liaison between the CIA, on the one hand, and the black operations units on the other. Furthermore, there was very real concern by William Casey and others that the CIA, after all of the scandals, the investigations, etc., had too high a profile, that it had to keep its head low on this. And so someone else was going to be the liaison rather than the CIA itself. That individual would be a member of the National Security Council staff, a Marine officer named Oliver North. This was a logic that grew out of an earlier time during the Nixon administration, when, of course, the National Security Council staff had been called upon to carry out a number of intelligence activities that would normally be conducted by the CIA. Having had that experience, it wasn't that hard to turn back to the National Security Council staff again and involve it, particularly Oliver North, in coordinating activities between the CIA and black operations. When funding becomes a problem in the mid-'80s, a scheme is concocted to find a way to fund the war in Nicaragua without getting additional support from Congress. The plan, simply put, is this: that we have a government in Iran that's rather hostile to us. As we will see next time, however, there are very good reasons why U.S. administrations throughout the second half of the 20th century have tried, even after the Islamic Republic was created in 1979, to improve relations with Iran. It has to do with things like oil and military capacity, etc., but every government, including the Reagan administration, wanted to improve relations with Iran, despite the turn that the regime had taken. Iran is engaged in a war with Iraq at this time, in the 1980s. They need defensive missiles, which the U.S. could supply them, and improve relations. Furthermore, the U.S. administration is certain that elements of the Iranian government know the whereabouts of hostages being held in the Middle East, U.S. hostages, and that they could assist in the freeing of those hostages. So, on the one hand, the U.S. intends to supply some of these weapons to the Iranians and in return improve relations and get some of its hostages freed. The other part of the plan is that we're not simply going to give the weapons away, we're going to sell them to the Iranians. The money from the sale will be used to fund the Contra war. That is why, after this operation begins and it's exposed, it becomes known as the Iran-Contra scandal, because we were selling weapons to Iran to earn money to pay for the Contras in Nicaragua. Again, in the mid-1980s, yet another scandal erupts involving the CIA, involving covert operations, involving illegal activities. Another congressional investigation ensues. Aside from that basic problem of another investigation, another scandal, there are other issues troubling the CIA at this time. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see one of these problems becomes known as blowback. Blowback means that when the CIA goes out and carries out a covert operation, they do things to achieve their goals that later have a negative effect on the United States. In other words, that operation blows back on the U.S. government itself. One such event involved our relationships with the dictator of Panama, Manuel Noriega. Noriega was providing intelligence information to the United States about both Cuba, where he had good relations with Castro, and about the government in Nicaragua that he also had good relations with. So, although he's a dictator, he is providing useful intelligence information, and we're more than happy to help keep him in power. He was also a double agent, by the way, because he was also providing intelligence information to the Cubans and to the Nicaraguans about us. But at the time, we figured mostly it was good information for us. So we were willing to accept the fact that he was a drug dealer. Not personally, but he was basically renting out large parts of territory in Panama so that drug planes flying out of Colombia could land there as a stopover point before continuing journeys up through Central America and then bringing their cargoes into the United States. This is a major source of the cocaine network that funneled drugs into the United States during the 1980s. Another part of this problem was connected specifically to Nicaragua itself. The U.S. was aware that not only was Noriega involved in drug dealing, but many of the people whom we were supporting as a part of the Contra force in Nicaragua were also involved in drug dealing. And as you'll see on the slide, in 1982, the CIA took the precaution of going to the Attorney General and getting an agreement that absolved CIA officials and those working with the CIA from any legal consequences due to their activities. What this meant was it was a free pass for the CIA and those Nicaraguans involved in the Contra War, should they suffer the embarrassment of being arrested by U.S. officials for drug dealing. Now, this doesn't mean that CIA officers were dealing in drugs. They weren't. But they were cognizant of the fact that people that they were associating with and supporting were indeed doing that. And they did not want those operations interrupted because they're a major source of income for those supporting the Contras. In fact, this network was chiefly responsible for the rapid growth of the crack cocaine epidemic in Los Angeles, and was specifically tied to a man named Freeway Ricky Ross, who was considered the major crack dealer on the streets of L.A. in the mid-1980s. Now again, this is not saying the agency was doing this directly, but they were associated with these people, and they had guarantees from the Attorney General's office that there would not be prosecution of these people in order to allow them to continue their operations in Nicaragua. Eventually, we would have to invade Panama to get rid of Noriega, whose usefulness had largely disappeared when the Contra War ends, something we'll get to later. And the CIA eventually was exposed for its dealings with drug dealers in the U.S. and, of course, accused of contributing to the outbreak of the crack cocaine epidemic in the United States. How much it can be blamed for it is a matter of debate. But nevertheless, the very idea that the CIA would be associating with people who were known drug dealers and actually seek protection from the law for these people and for the CIA itself was a startling revelation. Now, once again, as we see in the next slide, times were tough for the CIA. There was once again scandal in 1985, 1986, the Iran-Contra investigation, the realization that the CIA, the Reagan administration, had broken the law. They had been selling the weapons of the United States illegally. These transfers of money were illegal to the Contras, et cetera, et cetera. Once again, there was felt the need for reform. Fortunately, nobody had to fire Bill Casey. He died of brain cancer. But they would have to bring in someone to straighten it all out. And once again, they would turn to an outsider. Agencies being racked by scandal, like 1961, it's like 1977 with Stansfield Turner, a third time. Well, yet an outsider. And this time they choose none other than the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, William Foster, who was known in the CIA as Mild Bill, as opposed to William Donovan being known as Wild Bill. Here was Mild Bill Foster. He was generally loathed by CIA officers. Part of this was that he came from a different culture. The FBI is a law enforcement agency. Okay? What it tries to do is gather evidence so people can be prosecuted. CIA is an intelligence agency. It steals secrets, overthrows governments. They do two different kinds of things. And it was felt that Foster was far too restrained, far too cautious, and simply didn't understand the functions of the agency. And besides which, as we have seen, the FBI and the CIA have been rivals for years, and now to have the director of the FBI put in charge of the CIA infuriated career officers in the Central Intelligence Agency. It was like the ultimate insult to put the head of the FBI in charge of the CIA. So Foster's years would be difficult years for him because the agency was deeply resentful of his tenure as Director of Central Intelligence. Now, with the coming of Bill Clinton to office, it's time for another change. People in the CIA, this is not because of some scandal, it's far more because people within the agency are dying to get rid of Foster, and by now Foster is dying to get out of there. And this time, they turn to someone who is not a CIA insider on the one hand. He does not have a record of a career in the CIA, and by now OSS officers are too old to even remember how old they are, so you're not really going to be recruiting another OSS type. These guys are dying like flies. But he is someone who is an insider within the government and within the government's policy making on intelligence. As I point out here on this slide, he was an aide to the Senate Intelligence Committee in 1985, when the Senate Intelligence Committee, of course, is investigating the Iran-Contra scandal. So he's quite familiar with the workings of the CIA and with how Congress views and deals with the CIA, etc. And from there, in 1995, he was made Deputy Director of Central Intelligence. And from there, he would be appointed as the director, and as of this taping at least, he has served one of the longest terms of any director of Central Intelligence in the history of the agency. He and Foster before him faced major challenges, one of which was the end of the Cold War. One of the problems with the end of the Cold War was that the CIA's ability at intelligence gathering and analysis was once again questioned. When the Soviet Union effectively collapses in 1989, one of the first questions raised was, why did this come as such a surprise? Why weren't we prepared? The CIA, almost up until the end of the Gorbachev era, was focused on what it had been doing since the late 1940s, spying on the Soviet Union, trying to gather additional intelligence information, learn more about their nuclear program, etc., etc. Nothing was being done to analyze the survivability of the regime because it wasn't considered a serious issue. So there was no preparation. So immediately, this great success, as it seemed, that we won the Cold War, our enemy's defeated, the regime has collapsed. On the other hand, it immediately raised new questions about the agency. These guys, they've been studying this place for 50 years. Why didn't they see this coming? So it causes a new problem for the CIA and new criticism of the agency and its ability. Beyond that, the end of the Cold War raises an even larger question, and that is, why do we need the CIA anymore? What is the mission of the CIA? I mean, the Soviet Union has collapsed. Eastern Europe is disintegrating as the various communist regimes are overthrown and replaced by a variety of semi-democratic, democratic regimes. Even the People's Republic of China, although it's still calling itself a communist country, is radically altering its policies and is clearly pursuing a policy of state capitalism, is opening up itself to world trade and foreign investment, etc. It certainly isn't a communist regime anymore. I mean, communist regimes can be limited to Cuba, North Korea, Vietnam. That's about it. And none of them, are exactly world powers. So what are we doing with this agency? And its whole focus has been to combat communism, whether directly in places like the Soviet Union and China or in third world countries. And now that threat has gone. Do we really need an agency of this sort? Do we need to be expending this kind of money? And there are various proposals floated in the early 1990s. You know, maybe we should have it focus on the drug war. Although we've already got the DEA, they could do other aspects, intelligence aspects of fighting the drug trade. Maybe we could turn them to spying, doing economic espionage for us, so we could spy on other countries in terms of their technological secrets, etc. A variety of propositions, none of them very inviting for the agency, but there was a real question about, do we need this place anymore? Because the major threat, which it was designed to combat, has disappeared. Then on top of that, there comes the scandal of the Gulf War. When Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, again, up until just before the invasion, there apparently was not significant warning from the agency until Saddam's troops were already massed on the Kuwaiti border. Until, you know, anyone who could read satellite reconnaissance could tell, boy, all these people down on the Kuwaiti border, you know, they're on the other side, called Iraq. There's something wrong here. Now, this criticism may have been overblown. Certainly the CIA would debate and take what I've said as an overblown statement, but because they say, well, we did a lot more than that in terms of warning of this possibility. But the fact is that when the invasion came, and the CIA will say, for example, that the Bush administration was too concerned with keeping Saddam happy and, you know, figuring that all he was doing was pressuring the Kuwaitis for some share in their oil revenues. But in any case, when the invasion comes, there really is no early warning system. There's hardly any possibility of the U.S. preparing, and for responding in the short term, the invasion's over before they can even do anything, and Kuwait is occupied. So once again, with all its other problems and people questioning whether it deserves to even exist anymore, the agency now has a new problem at the beginning of the 1990s, that it failed to predict the outbreak of the war in the Middle East, the invasion of Iraq. Oops. I got to go back here, folks. Now, as all of this is unfolding, the CIA has another set of problems. Through the 80s and in the 90s, as you see here, really from 1984 to 2001, a series of spies are discovered. And the first group, except for the last one, they're CIA officers. Apparently, James Angleton's greatest fear has come to fruition. And we might well say, my God, the guy was right all along. Except he was wrong. Angleton believed that there was a mole, or perhaps two, in the CIA, that these people were of Eastern European origin, had probably entered the agency in the late 40s, maybe early 50s, when the agency was recruiting Eastern Europeans because of their language skills, their knowledge of their countries. This is the time we were fighting the Cold War in Eastern Europe. And a number of people who were either immigrants from Eastern Europe or the children of immigrants from Eastern Europe joined the CIA. And Angleton believed that it was from this group, and he narrowed it down to a couple of dozen people in the end that cast his suspicion on, that it was among these people that he would find the mole or moles that were undermining the CIA from within. Only those people didn't exist. In fact, the people that did sell out the agency were foursquare, native-born U.S. citizens, and they did it for money. They didn't get converted, in fact. The Soviets didn't come to them and say, gee, you want to spy for us? They went to the Soviets and said, how'd you like me to spy for you? Okay? Pay me, and it's yours. Edward Lee Howard, 1984, who managed, by the way, to the embarrassment of the CIA and the FBI, to escape from the United States. was one of these people. The damage that Howard did was relatively limited. And again, it's debated because, of course, the CIA doesn't want to reveal all of this in public. But his damage compared to a couple of the others would be considered relatively minor in terms of the intelligence information he could give the Soviets. But just as Edward Lee Howard is being uncovered and fleeing the country, another CIA officer is undertaking the role of double agent, a man named Aldrich Ames. Aldrich Ames was the son of a CIA officer. His father had worked for the agency in the 1950s. And he had been recruited into the agency in part because he was a legacy. He was a son of a former officer. So some blemishes on his record were overlooked. And the fact that he wasn't exactly a genius as a CIA officer was also largely overlooked. His biggest problem being that he was given opportunities. The way to get ahead is you're assigned to Moscow, Eastern Europe, etc., and you go out and you recruit agents, Soviet citizens or citizens of whatever country you're in, to spy for you. That's how you prove your mettle. And he was not very good at this. He just wasn't very good at it at all. And eventually, he was sent back to Washington and spent the rest of his career in Washington. That's also a bad sign because it's like the military. If there's a war, you want to be in the war because that's how you move up the ranks. That's how you earn a reputation. Well, in the CIA, if you spend your whole life sitting in Langley, Virginia, just doing analysis, you're not going to move up very far. You have to be out there as an active officer, recruiting agents and providing information, engaging in the development of covert operations, etc. That's where the action is. And throughout the latter part of his career, Ames was not doing that, particularly in this period from 85 on when he was spying for the Soviets. He also had a major drinking problem. He was a first-class alcoholic. He was plastered every night, and it was known in the agency because he would go to social occasions, and this was even earlier in his career when he was working out of embassies around the world, for the U.S. and for the CIA. He'd go to events and just get sloppy drunk. This is a problem, If you work for the CIA and you're a sloppy drunk, if nothing else, you got to be worried that this guy's going to say something or something because he's dead drunk. He doesn't even know who he's talking to. That, too, along with his relatively poor performance, was largely ignored. However, problems arose in the latter part of the 80s because many of the Soviet citizens who had been recruited by the CIA and were serving as spies for the Central Intelligence Agency in the Soviet Union were being arrested by the Soviets. Well, they didn't know the CIA didn't know they were arrested. They know they were disappearing. And odds were they were being arrested. And the CIA, in the middle to late 80s, is trying to figure out what's going wrong here. How are these people being rounded up? Because you can understand that, some of these people are going to get caught sooner or later, no matter what. They're going to make mistakes, and the Soviets will catch them. But to have them all rounded up, or so many of them, dozens of them, disappearing one after another, dozens of top people disappearing, had to mean that there was a major problem. And the problem, almost certainly, after review, was in the agency itself. The problem was, who was that source? And the agency now begins, albeit reluctantly, to search for this mole. There had been hesitancy, and even in the initial searches, in the latter part of the 1980s, there's a hesitancy to push too hard. There are a series of such investigations that occur. And on more than one occasion, Aldrich Ames's name appears on a short list. He was making the top 10. And you would think, after this happens a couple of times, people begin to think, how is it that every time we look for this person and we come up with a short list of suspects, this guy's name is always on it. But again, there's a hesitancy in the agency because of what Angleton did. You know, do we really want to tear the agency up again, searching for somebody that may not exist? And besides which, Ames is a legacy. You know, he's been part of the agency. Do we really want to go after this guy? Finally, in 1993, 1994, the FBI is brought in to assist in this search. And finally, Ames is identified. And this only after, it should be pointed out, that Ames was spending money like water. He drove a Jaguar. He had a house worth that he'd spent cash on. He'd spent hundreds of thousands of dollars buying this house. He's an FBI, he's a CIA officer. You know, he's pulling down $70,000 if he's lucky. And he's laying down hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash for a house and driving a Jaguar. And his wife doesn't work. So it's not like, oh, my wife's, you know, a high-powered D.C. attorney, and that's where my money comes from. His explanation is, my wife's family, she was from Colombia, is wealthy, and her parents died and left us money. But nobody bothered checking the story. Nobody bothered saying, well, let's trace the money then. I mean, if there's hundreds of thousands of dollars there, there'll be records of, you know, a legal settlement of the estate in Colombia and then the transfer of that money to Ames and his wife. Nobody bothered checking. Until the FBI finally tracked all of this down, and one fine morning, they arrest Aldrich Ames as he pulls out his Jaguar to go to work. The impact of this is that in the government it was believed, from now on, we can only trust the FBI as far as this stuff goes. And we've had several spy scandals in the agency now, but particularly with Aldrich Ames, you know, it's clear that this guy was around for years. He was spying for a decade, and they couldn't catch him, and he was hardly the most astute spy in the world. You know, he's a severe alcoholic. He's spending money like water. He's making ostentatious displays of wealth with a car that he drives into the parking lot in Langley, Virginia every day that he couldn't possibly afford. And yet they still didn't catch him. So from now on, the FBI, and of course, as we will see, this further tears the relationship between the FBI and the CIA, because the CIA is saying that was bloody. You know, they are lauding it over as so suppose they're the only ones that know how to, you know, do counter-espionage, and we're a bunch of bumpkins, right? So there's even further alienation between the two sides, and CIA and FBI offices literally despising each other over this controversy. And then, if you look at the slide one more time, the icing on the cake comes in 2001. When you see that last piece of the slide, you will see that in 2001, Robert Hanssen, an FBI officer, can we come back to the slide? There we go. Robert Hanssen, an FBI officer, who was an important actor in the FBI's counter-Soviet operations, was exposed as a Soviet spy. An FBI officer, the son of a police officer, a man considered a four-square patriot, you know, a conservative Catholic, and he sold out his country. So now, who do you trust? FBI, CIA, neither one. So these scandals deeply disrupt the esprit de corps of the agency itself, its relationships with the FBI, and generally public confidence in both of these institutions. One of the things that had happened here is that with Vietnam, the end of the Cold War, etc., for a very long time, the scandals that had erupted in the 70s, for a quarter of a century, the agency had been losing its panache, its appeal. You know, for a long time, people from Yale and Harvard and elsewhere, members of the elite, wanted to be a part of the CIA. We're fighting this great crusade for civilization. And they were willing to accept the fact that they weren't going to make a lot of money in the CIA working for it. They didn't have to worry, most of them, because they're Parents had loads of money. But that appeal has largely disappeared, certainly by the mid-1970s. And it's getting tougher to recruit people who take this on as an idealistic task. And so, almost inevitably, quality goes down because it does not have that kind of appeal. It certainly doesn't appeal as a high-paying job. And now it lacks the appeal of, well, we're in this worldwide crusade to save Western civilization from communist dangers, etc. That's largely disappeared. So this contributes to this problem, this outbreak, shall we say, of spies, that too many people in the CIA see it essentially as a job. And when they suffer the career disappointments that a lot of people suffer during their lives, they're more than willing in the end to say, well, I guess I want some money. Hanssen's motivations may be a little bit harder to analyze. He seemed to have some problems with his father and authority and delusions of grandeur for himself. But for Howard and for Aldrich Ames, it was pretty much, I want money. So I'll sell the secrets that I have. Reflecting the fact that there was less of this kind of commitment to a cause than had existed after the agency was created in 1947. Now, it's in the midst of these tumultuous events that the agency has to come to grips with the threat of terrorism. And if we go to that next slide, we'll see that just as all these other problems are accumulating, the Iran-Contra scandal and then the spy scandals, the threat of terror is growing against the United States. In 1983, a massive bomb in Beirut, Lebanon, kills 6 CIA officers and a number of U.S. Embassy personnel, including, among the people killed, was the station chief in Beirut. To replace that station chief, another CIA officer named William Buckley is appointed in 1984. And is subsequently kidnapped by a terrorist group and held hostage and tortured. This kind of event, and we're just mentioning one of the most spectacular, made it clear to the CIA that it was going to have to deal with this problem. And in 1986, it created the Counterterrorism Center. The Counterterrorism Center was meant to coordinate counter-terrorist activities among the CIA, FBI, and other federal agencies, but it was largely, during its development, a CIA operation. One of the reasons is the CIA and the FBI hate each other. They're not going to cooperate with each other, even on something as important as counterterror. But, of course, in the public's mind at this time, yes, there was an awareness of terror, but nobody was striking the homeland, right? So, yeah, it's an issue out there and a concern, but it's not as if it's the number one issue on the public's mind at any given moment. Then in 1983 comes the first bombing of the World Trade Center, organized by Ramzi Youssef. And we will come back to Youssef and look at him when we look more specifically at the Age of Terror. Here now, of course, is a threat that struck at the homeland. And if we go back to that slide just for one more time, when the bombing occurs, and it quickly becomes apparent that a number of the people involved in this operation were Afghan Arabs, people that had been recruited to help fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. This quote, this statement, came from the head of the FBI office in New York City at the time of the bombing in 1993. These guys were trained by the CIA. And these guys, he wasn't referring to CIA recruits, he was talking about the people who committed the bombing. Now, he's wrong about that. They were not directly trained by the CIA. The truth we'll get to when we get to the Age of Terror. But The first reaction from the FBI was, well, they had been following some of these people. They were trying to get a lead on them, but they knew that these people were connected to CIA operations in Afghanistan. And immediately the question arises, is this another blowback? Are we being attacked, by the people that we trained to fight the Soviets? Needless to say, that didn't help much in FBI-CIA relationships either. So the FBI is saying, well, how this all happened, you guys did it. You trained them. In the aftermath of the World Trade Center, we have the emergence of Al-Qaeda, and again, we're going to get into this in detail when we get to the Age of Terror, but nevertheless, the Al-Qaeda terrorist network comes to the fore in the minds of Americans during the 1990s, but especially at the beginning of the 21st century. The attack on the USS Cole in Yemen in October of 2000. And then, of course, the events of September 11th, 2001. Those events, of course, shake the United States to its foundations. And after the horror has passed, the question immediately becomes, how could this possibly happen? How, with the Federal Bureau of Investigation responsible for domestic security, the Central Intelligence Agency responsible for overseas security, and with its own counterterrorism center, how could an attack of this magnitude be planned and executed without any warning on the part of these agencies that are responsible for the security of the United States? Those are questions we're going to look into when we look again at the Age of Terror. But I can say now that some of the answers are already there in your notes, because some of the problems that led to this breakdown are inherent in the history of the agency. One of the problems, shouldn't be a surprise at this point, was the constant institutional clash between the FBI and the CIA. Rather than cooperation, it has largely been a history of conflict. And in fact, as we will see in detail, that conflict had intensified in the 1990s with events like Aldrich, Ames, etc., and made it only worse. So without close cooperation between these two agencies, there was going to inevitably be huge holes in the coverage provided for the United States itself. Now, those issues, which have yet to be fully resolved in this country, do seem to fade into the background quickly because the focus of the Bush administration, the U.S. government, becomes launching a counterattack upon Al-Qaeda. And, of course, that leads to the invasion of Afghanistan in the months after the attack on New York and Washington. And in those events, the CIA plays an important part in working with various groups within Afghanistan. Obviously, it had long-standing contacts with groups in Afghanistan. It assists with intelligence information. It assists with paramilitary activities. And after that successful war, it also comes to play a major role in the war on terrorism itself, in the effort to hunt down members of the Al-Qaeda network and other terrorist organizations, and has been fairly successful in identifying and seizing a number of key figures within Al-Qaeda itself. So much of the attention that was initially focused on what happened on 9/11 has passed, even though there is still, as of this time, a commission that is studying those events and trying to understand them. Public attention has largely shifted away from that question of how could that have happened. However, things have not gone all that well for the agency, because after the questions about how could 9/11 happen were at least set aside or dwarfed by its activities in the war against terrorism. New issues have arisen since then with the second war in Iraq, and specifically questions on weapons of mass destruction that are, of course, at this moment, headline news, but no matter what, raise new and serious questions again about the agency's intelligence capabilities. How could we be so wrong about the weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein supposedly had and that played a major role in the decision to go to war against Iraq? Again, we're going to come back and look at this as a part of the session on the Age of Terror and look at specific problems that, although we're still dealing with contemporary events, there are still some basic points that we can make. And, again, it won't surprise you, as with 9/11, many of the answers lie within this history of the CIA that we've been covering. Because, as you now know, intelligence failures are not new to the agency. Institutional problems are not new to the agency. And we won't be surprised in the end to discover that many of the problems that will ultimately be identified as leading to these current failures are embedded in this past. Looking back at all of this, as a sort of summary, the factors that have influenced the agency and its development as we look at its history. One, the legacy of the OSS. The OSS provided a model for the creation of the CIA. You look at the basic activities that the OSS carried out: intelligence gathering and analysis, covert operations, psychological warfare, typically carried out by the CIA as well. More importantly, there is the legacy of OSS influence, of so many OSS officers who became CIA officers and certainly gave the agency a particular capability for covert operations. Secondly, the outbreak of the Cold War in Europe. By 1948, the U.S. is deeply concerned about communist political parties in Western Europe and about the mounting power of the Soviet Union and its Eastern European allies. And that becomes a major reason for bringing in the CIA to conduct covert operations as early as the late 1940s, the Office of Policy Coordination that we talked about that eventually is completely reincorporated into the CIA. But from early on, the CIA gets involved or pulled into covert operations because of the Cold War. Another factor that pushes the agency in this direction, despite its mandate to carry out intelligence gathering and analysis, are turf wars, battles with the FBI, with military intelligence, meaning that the one place apparently nobody wants the CIA operating is the one place it was supposed to operate, and that is gathering data from all these agencies and analyzing it for the executive. But nobody wants them to have that control, certainly not military intelligence, not the FBI, etc. So, while that's hostile territory, a whole other field, covert operations, they're more than happy to let the CIA take that on. That set of influences is reinforced, of course, by the people who become directors and key players in the agency. Particularly Allen Dulles, who considered himself and was considered, this master spy who was obsessed with covert operations and basically built a wall between covert operations and intelligence and put his interest, his backing, on the covert operations side of the agency. And then a whole network of people around him who later rose to the same position, like Richard Helms, William Colby, etc. In addition, if we go back to this slide, another reason for covert operations and why the CIA became so heavily involved is simply the needs of U.S. foreign policy. When we're dealing with a difficult situation, particularly for us in the Third World, where it might be risky to use military force, we might have to confront the Soviet Union, say Afghanistan, where we might be overextending ourselves, committing military forces in too many places, or where a country simply is not willing to be beguiled by offers of U.S. aid or U.S. friendly relations. Covert operations offers a way of fulfilling the goals of U.S. foreign policy without resorting to these other, sometimes riskier strategies. And there is also the appeal in covert operations by the CIA of plausible deniability, that a president frustrated by dealing with a recalcitrant regime in the third world can say, okay, they're gone. And yeah, it might be illegal, but I don't have to worry about it, because even if we get caught, I'll just blame it all on the CIA and say, I didn't tell them to do that. I don't know what they were doing. The third world became a magnet for such operations because the third world had relatively weak regimes with weak security networks. Since then, we have seen the weakening of the agency over time. Scandals, too numerous to recount. The failure in Vietnam. The end of the Cold War, which raised the question of should the agency exist at all? And finally, the decline of esprit de corps, of commitment to a cause, and the outbreak of spy scandals. The Soviet Union and Saddam, the limits of intelligence analysis, the confines of ideology, that we too, like Joe Stalin, have our own ideology. We believe what we want. Too many times the agency and American leaders engage in easy analogies to analyze events, such as Truman seeing the Korean War as another Hitler invading Europe, and institutional limitations, the limits of the capacity of the agency itself to carry out its mission. All of these were problems that have haunted the agency and limit its capacity even to today. You want the previous one?